Sorry, boy, but his captain's got to teach his men what happens to those what crossing.
Captain's got to teach stuff.
Good morning, I guess good afternoon, good evening, whatever, good afternoon, good evening, and good night from the Batcave. It is Sunday, August 3rd, and I kind of just got done writing, at least the first draft of my second chapter of my Serpent by the Way book, which is just called the Babel Effect. So chapter 1 is Legends of the Old Gods, and it basically just covers all the stuff from the antediluvian period up until the Tower of Babel. Gives you kind of the core gods and where they're coming from, and then what the religious views are and where they're coming from. And you're really dealing with two systems that exist at this time. You deal with the Sethite system, which gets corrupted before the flood, and into a lot of mythologies and gods and myth related to Nephilim production, and then the Canaanite system, which gets corrupted according to basically the belief that the serpent is the bringer of wisdom, so he becomes the Promethean god that helps mankind advance, and then they look at Yahweh as the god that's disrupting man's advancement. So you basically have the overtly satanic religion based around materialism and technology, and then the corrupt, supposedly true religion, which is based around a corruption of the promise to the seed of the woman promise, which starts to get fulfilled through Nephilim, basically. So remember, Satan's always going to give you two bad ideas and have you fight over which one is better, and it's just a matter of just like, one thing that's more blatantly against God, and then the other thing that seems like it's for God, but it's also corrupted. And you're going to find this over and over and over again through history, and we see it today in our left wing versus right wing. Our right wing is, the supposedly, Christian right party that is trying to fulfill God's way through their own means, right? And not necessarily through Nephilim, but through warfare and capitalism and stuff like this to try to force the world into at least subjugating itself to Christianity. And to be fair, they are somewhat fulfilling prophecies about Japhethite dominating, and it's really the religion of the Canaanites that they're dominating, but it's dispersed through Canaanites throughout the world, and it has been primarily picked up by brown people, whereas the Judeo-Christian worldview has been primarily picked up by white people, not exclusively and not even predominantly, but when you talk about the general trajectory of the acceptance of Christianity versus the diffusion of the Canaanite religion, they're in the global north versus the global south. And obviously you have Islam, competing and intersecting with that, which is just a version of the Canaanite religion based around the moon god Sin or Nana, which is then infused with elements of Judaism and Christianity to become what it is today. And it's the biggest latecomer to the game. I mean, Mormonism is obviously later, but in terms of the world's major religions that aren't considered a branch of any other religion, Islam is the latecomer, and it really is a branch of Gnosticism that is based around Jewish Christian ideas and then Zoroastrianism and the occult. So it really is a syncretic religion. And there's this doctor, I forget his name, Phil something, that has actually been doing a lot of great work to prove that Muhammad probably didn't even exist. It's probably a guy that it was a title for a Mahmud, which basically means a blessed one, which became Muhammad like 300 years afterwards in the Baghdad period of rule. So it's not even in like the original caliphate or in the generation. It's like 200-300 years after Muhammad where the first things written about him are pulled together, and it's like, okay, who is this guy? Well, he could have been several different guys, and they just put it together to try to make this legend into something true. Maybe there was an original Muhammad, but who we have in the Hadith and all this stuff does not seem to be based on a near reflection of a guy that's legit. So, compared to Christianity, where you've got reports of Christ immediately afterwards, or compared to the Jewish scriptures, where we see how close the evidence and the data and the maps and stuff like that are to the guys, we know that the hadiths and the reports of Mahmud that are running around aren't even in places where Muhammad was. So it's like, who is this Mahmud guy who becomes, when the Arabic language gets formatted in its current version becomes Muhammad. Okay, so anyways, long story short, of the ancient religions, it's mostly boiling down to the Judeo-Christian tradition and then the Canaanite tradition, which is going to lightly influence Zoroastrianism, but the heavier Canaanite influence version of that is Hinduism, whereas Zoroastrianism is probably a purer form of the Japhethite religion, which has elements of Noahic testimony that aren't in the scriptures until you get towards the end of the Old Testament and the prophets, and then in Christianity, which has to do with the earth being dissolved by fire at the end and the final judgment and the creation of a new heavens and new earth. Those things are in Zoroastrianism. They're not in Christianity, and this is what leads people to believe that things were borrowed from Zoroastrianism, and they probably weren't. These things were probably in the Book of the Righteous. I'm operating under the presumptions that the Book of the Righteous was probably Shem's book, and Shem probably, again, this book was probably in Proto-Hebrew once upon a time. Things were drawn out of it or added to it in the days of Moses, all the way down through the days of David. We know there are things that were testified as being in the Book of the Righteous having to do with David training people to shoot bows after Solomon. So it seems like for a time the Jews were trying to keep up this Book of the Righteous, which was something else than the scriptures. So what was it? Where did it originate? We don't really know, and we don't really have any evidence that there's anything in it that's not in the Bible, because the only things we know about it are the things that are in the Bible. What it probably is not is the 13th century basically invention by Jews who are making stuff up, which becomes the Book of Jasher. That's nothing. Don't read anything in the Book of Jasher or take it as serious. It's garbage. It's just pure speculation, basically. But there was probably something along the lines of Book of Righteous that Shem had, and there was probably oral history and even prophecy that Noah gave, because Noah lived for 350 years after the flood. I'm sure he still communed with God. I'm sure he still got prophetic dreams and stuff. And it shouldn't be shocking that he might have passed some stuff down to Japheth, because he clearly was the closest with Japheth. Shem is the guy he appoints as a successor, but in terms of proximity, in terms of them seeming to be alike, they're both kind of crafty guys, he seemed to have poured the most into Japheth. And then these things seem to trickle down into Zoroastrianism, and it's not a lot of stuff, but it's basic things that we're going to find emerging in Isaiah and Malachi, and then in the book of Revelation and 2 Peter and stuff like that. But you can't escape the fact that these things were in Zoroastrianism 1,000 years before they're in Christianity. Now, that being said, Zoroastrianism is a false religion. It is influenced by the Canaanites both for and against, and there seems to be another version of that false dichotomy going on in Zarathustra's day, if he is a real person, because he's talking about these other wicked priests that are corrupting things, and he's trying to reform in opposition to them. And one of the things he comes up with is the idea of animal sacrifice being bad, which is contrary to the Bible. And he blames Yima, who is basically their Noah, for giving into man's carnal desires by letting him eat the flesh of the bull. So that's something that is very clearly, if Yima is Noah, he's blaming Noah for letting them eat meat. So whoever this is a corrupt religion that is forming sometime after the Tower of Babel, if Zarathustra is a real person. More than likely, Zarathustra is based in Zeusudra, and he's more like a Muhammad or a Buddha, where the writings about who he is and what he taught were formatted after the fact, because the Gathas are basically, which are supposedly coming from him, are basically the first examples of the Old Avestan script. So the idea that the original guy also wrote the original hymns in the first example that we know of the original language, when this guy's probably a camel herder, is just not likely. What is more than likely is that Zarathustra is the original prototype that becomes Mani and Muhammad and these other guys after the fact. They're all based on Zoroaster, who is this reformer prophet who is coming in claiming divine revelation, which he's definitely claiming, and coming up with something that tries to be as simplified, where Manichaeism is a complex religion, Mithraism is a complex religion, but what Zarathustra and Mohammedanism or Islam seem to have in common is it's the idea of simplifying the religion down to very basic core tenets of belief and ritual and stuff like that, from a corrupt, paganized mystery cult that is it's basically opposing. So it's a false dichotomy, which is, if you understand that the Zarathustrian or Zoroastrian religion is up against probably the spread of the Canaanite religion into the Persian peoples, so is Muhammad up against the spread of Canaanite idolatry into the Roman Catholic Church, which is all transubstantiation and Mariology and iconoclasm is, or iconodules is what they call them, but basically people who love idols. They're just idols. They call them icons, but it's just idols. That's all it is, okay? So anyways, back to my book. The Babel effect is basically going to go through, and it's going to cover the basic summary of my theory on what happened after Babel, when it happened, what the major effects are. But at the end of the day, it's going up against these secular comparative mythology theories that are out there, which essentially say that, the flood myth is based on the Younger Dryas theory from 12,000 years ago, and it's just this memorized myth, and they're literally saying, well, there was another ice age probably 60,000 years before that, and the reason you seem to have two layers of mythology with common elements but distinct elements is because they're remembering two distinct floods, one from 12,000 years ago and one from like 60,000 years ago. And the idea that that's what they're remembering is absurd unless the whole world has ice age myths, and you literally don't have any. So you do have a few, but I want to just break it down to where I've been able to find them. So if you guys want to research this stuff and you want to nerd out on this stuff like me, there's this website that carries flood stories from around the world. So just look up Mark Isaac and flood stories from around the world. Now, I've looked at these links and I've tried to email this guy. I can't connect with him. He may be dead for all I know. I mean, this is from 24 years ago. But this guy looks like he was working on this website from 1996 to 2002. And praise the Lord for the work that this guy put forward. He basically just collects tons of flood myths, and he explains how he groups them, what his criteria are for selecting them, and then he groups them by region. And so what this allows you to do, and if somebody wants to be a nerd and do things that I don't have time to do, and just put together a map of these stories with some kind of like matrix of what elements of the Noahic flood story are in it, and then also what elements of the Canaanite flood story are in it, because these are important. This is like the idea of the Canaanites believing God just got mad at them or didn't like the overpopulation of the world, and that's why he's flooding the world. And versus this secondary flood, I'm going to call it, which is based on the rising sea levels and probably people influenced by the Canaanite myth, basically running up into the mountaintops and having incestuous relationship like Lot and his daughters, which turn into a bunch of tribal peoples that look a lot alike, speak the same language, are isolated in an island or up in mountain tribal communities that ultimately end up mixing together in Southeast Asia, largely, and to lesser degrees, scattered throughout Oceania and lesser degrees in North America. That's basically my flood theory, and I'm going to kind of break down how this goes. So again, in this book, I'm going to cover the Babylonian dispersion. I'm going to cover the Atrahasis and Merkur and the Lord of Arata, which basically seem to be legends written in Sumer and Akkad in the generation after the flood, so within probably 50 to 100 years after the flood. And then I'm going to go into the major dispersions of people which seem to have had influence by the Canaanites. So first, I'm going to cover the Bantu migration, which I believe the Bantu are the people of Punt who traveled across Africa following elephant migrations. And then they ended up settling over there, probably getting some people from Sumer to help them establish agriculture, because they were the guys who they found the old cuneiform in Egypt and Sumer, and they figured out their old tricks and stuff like that to growing crops and irrigation and probably genetic modification of not like gene modification, but like the breeding of crops and making crops more abundant, basically. So crops can actually breed up or breed down based on the resources that they have available, just like animals can, and to lesser degrees, just like humans can. We're designed to be able to survive in the different climates we go to. There may be a point when those things get locked in, but I don't think they do get locked in. I think human beings were designed to mix and mingle and change our genes and younger generations to thrive better in the environments that we live in, and that seems to shift across the world, both with plants, animals, and humans, based on the things like solar radiation, the amount of heat, amount of water, things like that, the amount of cold, the amount of sunlight. And what you end up with is the Bantu. This is a big hypothesis, so I'm not trying to like nail this stuff down for certain, but I believe there's Kushites, Puntites, which become the name Bantu, and then probably some Sumerians in them, and these people probably become the Pygmies, the Khoisan people with the clicking languages, and then the major Bantu language groups. And then the Kushites mixed with Egyptian peoples become the Nilo-Saharan language groups. And then other groups are going to mix in with that. And eventually there's going to be Semitic coming in because all the Arab take over. And you're even going to have these... actually, let's get our little map back. So, if you can see this, you're going to have these people, which are probably Vandals. These Arab is probably Muslim. These Berbers over here, maybe they're mixtures of Arabic and Kushites. I really don't know, because you see E3, B2, it looks like they're related to Egyptians and Kushites, but I imagine there's heavy doses of Arab, probably Roman, probably Greek, probably Phoenician, and probably Germanic, from the centuries and centuries of different peoples who invaded and conquered that area. And then they become this core people that are essentially Kushite, but with some other genetic mix in there. Okay, so this is what you have, and then most of what goes on here is this migration towards the east of Sinites and Zemarites. Okay, and this migration towards the east is going to turn into these major population groups over here, and then these other population groups over here with a lot more mixture to them. And so you see peoples that are probably related to Kushites, Sinites, Zemarites, descendants of Rama and Shiva, who are sons of Cush, and then other later descendants of Ham, which, like the Khmer Rouge, is literally like they're descended from some guy whose letters are KHM, where literally like Ham is in Egypt is KHEM, that's Chem, and CHAM, Chem, and over here in the Khmer Rouge is KHM. It's the same guy, right? The Himalayas are based after Ham, right? So the Hamites, the Kushites, Rama and Shiva, we know these guys are counted in the days of Ezekiel, which is going to be almost 1,000 years later. And so what you're having here is the effects of these Sinites and these Zemarites diffusing among these people, not just their genetics, not just their linguistics, but also their religion. And so what you have, Zoroaster, again, he's over here, you see where Q2 is, and the Turkmen, well, here's Iran, here's where Oxus would have been, okay? And so you see Q here, and then Q up here, and then you're going to also find Q over in the Americas. Well, what are these? These are probably early Sinites who merged and married right in with the Japhethites over here, and they probably, again, these people weren't necessarily warring with each other. Almost all your war was taking place right here in the beginning. Okay, we don't have records of other wars going on. So you have Nimrod doing his thing, and then you have the Japhethites and the Semites getting together to stop Nimrod, and then after that you're going to have Hammurabi come around. But when you're talking about war, you're talking about somebody taking dominion over a local area. You're not talking about nations warring against each other, because you didn't have nations. You had family groups and clans, and people were related to each other, but you didn't have different language groups. You didn't have us versus them mentality of things. you had people trying to claim the dominion of the earth, which Nimrod and Hammurabi seem to try to do. Okay, Hammurabi seems to claim authority from Shem. Nimrod seems to claim authority from Noah, and again, that's Anu and Shamash. Okay, so by that time, the Tower of Babel happens. You obviously you're going to have violence breaking out after that, and that's going to turn into nationalized conflicts, which is going to be the rise of kings to lead the armies to defend the people. Basically, somebody who's going to serve as both a judge and a military commander of its armies, because somebody has to command them against the potential threat of these outsiders. And so what you're going to find in these myths as these people are moving across the world is basically hostility. Well, why? Well, there's these people who don't talk like us. And what happens is, as these people who don't talk like us, let's face it, we don't like people who don't talk like us right now. I go down in the hood and somebody just be like, he's talking all white. Like, we're from the same country, but we're different. We talk different. And this could be between young people and old people. Well, imagine their languages are like, I can't understand you from day or night, right? You're probably demon possessed. I don't know what your problem is. You guys do weird rituals. Oh, you do human sacrifice too? Let's kill those guys first, right? And this is what they're doing. And so what's happening with these Sumerians, they're probably down here in this place. The secularists call Sundenland, which is basically this. You see how Japan in this gray right here is these sea levels where these are close together. Well, we have pretty good Google Map stuff, and where we can look at like what parts of the islands are, or what parts of the seas are deeper and shallower, and imagine where these land bridges used to be with pretty good accuracy. Now, we know that this Qatar, what used to be called Dil Moon, okay? We know there was always some kind of sea here, but how deep was it? And this was the point. You could see how the Black Sea used to be much deeper. That's a freshwater lake underneath there. And before the sea levels rose, it was just fresh water. This was always salt water because this is much less deep. It was left behind from the flood probably, and then you have rivers pouring into it, and so it's more salty in the south than it is in the north because fresh water is filling it up. Okay, and you give it enough time, these seas will eventually lose their saltiness, which it talks about happening in the millennium. Like, that's what's going to happen with the Dead Sea in the millennium. Okay. But we could see these land bridges and go, okay, once upon a time, China and Japan were connected. So we don't have to figure out who sailed over here. These people just moved over here, and you had the Sea of Japan between them, and you had the South China Sea between like China and the Philippines. But all this land between Australia, with the exception of what you have the Banda Sea here and the Celeb Sea here, all these lands, the Artur Sea, the Timor Sea, the Java Sea, this all used to be a land bridge. This is how you explain how these animals that are unique to Australia got there. Either the global flood didn't happen, or there had to have been a land bridge after the flood. And we know this with some certainty that we can track to the modern era, because we know that there's this pygmy elephant. Now, there is no way elephants are going to migrate onto an island. So the pygmy elephant, this is the Borneo elephant. This is a version of it in Borneo, but there is this pygmy elephant that used to be on Crete, and it's just an elephant that's smaller. Well, it's probably not an elephant that was smaller. It's probably an elephant that grew to become smaller because it had less to eat. And so these guys would still survive and they would repopulate, but they're stuck on these islands and they would shrink. Just like the ones who get to go, up into the tundra, they grow longer hair, and the ones that go, where it's hot, they shed most of their hair, and their next generations come out more and more hairless. More vegetation and more water means they're just going to be bigger. Less vegetation and water means they're going to be smaller, right? And so they're adapting to become like this. Well, we know these pygmy elephants or pygmy mammoths existed on the islands of like Cyprus and Crete to as late as 2000 BC. We can date remains to that period. Well, that's after the flood by a few hundred years. Okay. So what we also know is that you can map these pygmy elephants. And we've got maps of these things on Cyprus, on Rhodes, on castles, on Crete. Well, the only way these elephants could have spread here, they ain't swimming. The only way they could have spread here, there's no way they're going to swim through a saltwater sea. No animal is going to be like, I'll see what's over there, is they wandered down here and then they got trapped by rising sea levels. So where you see this main part of the Mediterranean Sea between the boot heel of Italy and down through Egypt is mostly deeper. This area to the north was mostly shallower, and you see how it connects all the way down to Africa over here. So these elephants would have migrated up into here, probably from Africa. They probably wandered down into Africa and then up, or just down into Africa from here in the first place, because the ark is over here. And you would have to cross some stuff to get into Egypt, and they're going to be able to cross shallows, but maybe they just went that route. And then they went all over, and the ones in the north became big woolly mammoths, and these ones got stuck in the island, and they became southerly or smaller elephants. But the point is, then the sea levels rose after that, and they're stuck there. So we actually have evidence of this, because if you go to Genesis 10, it talks about the different sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and then it talks about the sons of Java, and it says, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodad, and by these were the isles of the Gentiles, dividing the lands, everyone after his own tongue and their family and their nations. Now, that is not just a generic statement about the Japhethites, because you're going to find a statement like this about each one of them, but you're going to find a specific location phrase about the peoples who are across the shores from Egypt. So, remember, Moses is coming out of Egypt and writing this, so this is his worldview. And so he's going to point to all of these Japhethite tribes, but it's the sons of Javan who the Egyptians have their direct connections with, because the Egyptians are actually ruling Crete during the time of the Egyptian hegemony, and then the Philistines kind of take over that after them. If you go down to the sons of Canaan, it talks about where they were and then how they scattered abroad from there. So, well, that's the next shore over that the Egyptians are interacting with the Canaanites, because they have Byblos and Carchemish there. And then if you go down to the Shemites, it's going to talk about where the sons of Joktan are. Okay, it doesn't tell you where any of the other sons are. And just like with the Shem, Ham, and Japheth, it doesn't tell you where any of the other sons are. But for whatever reason, the people at the bottom of the list, it's telling you where their generations are. And these are the guys who dwell from Mesha to Sephar, which is essentially the western coast of the Red Sea. So it's the guys opposite the Red Sea from them, it's the guys opposite north of them, and it's the guys opposite west of them on the Mediterranean Sea. So they're just telling you, here's who all the families are, and here's the people in immediate proximity to Egypt. Here's where they're located, okay? So it's like they're connecting this division of languages to their immediate worldview, if you will. Okay, and of course these other guys are going to span all over the world from where they are, but they're mostly around. They're mostly accessible by just sailing around Turkey into the Black Sea. That's where you can connect to most of the Japhethites, with the exception of probably Magog. And if you go to Ezekiel 27, which is about 1,000 years later, you're going to find most of these people trading with Tyre. So you're going to find, the ones you're not going to find is Tyrus, because the Thracians migrate north, and they're basically displaced by the Celts. And then remember how I told you how Tyre and the Tyrans and the Thracians and the Trojans are all related to them? Well, those guys kind of fade into the about 11th century BCE. And then they're going to mix with the Danites and keep going north, and they're going to become Norse peoples. They're also going to mix in with the Germanic peoples, and that's where all the other blonde hair, blue eyes come from. The sons of Javan are going to be mentioned. The sons of Madai are not going to be mentioned as trading with Tyre, because we know that they're land-based people who are going to be basically between the Assyrians and the Persians. So they have no direct connection. And then Magog are going to be up, where the Mongolians are, basically. Gomer, less so. They're between the Black and Caspian Sea. But we're going to read about these. These are Gomer's sons. Ashkenaz. Actually, let's just go to Ezekiel 27. We see Persia, which is a nation that didn't exist at this time. I believe these guys are a Median tribe or a Turkish tribe. You see Lud, that's the Lydians. You see Phut, that's Punt. That's going to be the Eritreans. You see Zidon, Arvad, Egypt, the Asherites, Bashan. You see Tyrus. So that is Tyrus is based on Tyrus, Tiras. Sor. So you see Tyrus is spelled differently. It's TiYrac, where Tyrus, the city, is called Sor. But they are based on the same person. And then you see the people who are trading with them. We see Persia, Lud. You see Javan, Tubal, Meshech. So these are all Japhetite peoples. Togarma, Dan and Javan. Most of these other guys, Sheba and Rama, those are Hamites. But the point is that many of these guys are still accessible 1,000 years later. I mean, this is almost a full 1,000 years. It's about 900 years later after Moses is writing this. So a lot of these people are still very accessible to the Mediterranean by sea. Others have been displaced and migrated and pushed, further up into Eurasia, basically. And the reason why they're so close back then, and why don't these guys just all run away and migrate away when the Assyrians and the Hittites start taking over? Why are they still there being subjugated by the Hittites, for instance, the Japhethites? And the reason is because you would have had an ice shield right here. And so there's only so far away they can go. And so what you find is the people of Javan are inhabiting, let's go back to our map here. The people of Javan are going to be mostly traveling what used to be land bridges to get to these different places, and then they're going to be isolated onto islands. And once they're isolated onto islands, they're going to get really good at sailing. Well, all this doesn't take place overnight. It takes place over 600-700 years. Okay, so just think of the past 600-700 years. 700 years ago, we were fighting Muslims over Spain on horseback with no concept of there being this other side of the world over here. That's what us Europeans were doing. Okay. Times change in 700 years. Technology changes in 700 years, and with the rising sea levels, you have humanity massively changing. And so you have these lands here, and I'm just giving you an example. This island right here is called Sumatra. Now, Sumatra, we know that Ibn Battuta, who is basically a Marco Polo of the Muslims, is going to come here and he's going to say this land is called Suma Udra, okay? And then we also have this land right here, you see, kind of where Singapore is, and that's Malaysia, okay? Well, they said over here that the Canaanites used to trade with this people called Maluha, okay? Well, Maluha seems to become Malaysia, and that seems to be the original name for this whole space south of the Himalayas here, because Maluha seems to mean something like land of flowing rivers, and of course, Indus, which is a Sanskrit word, which is Japhethite, is going to mean rivers. Indus just means rivers. Okay, so Udra is a base word for waters. Indra is Lord of the flood or the flow, and Indus is river. So Ind and Und, you see these things are related to water and rivers and flowing. Okay, so what's the Sum mean? Well, Sum can mean together. Sun means together in Japhethites, but it probably means Sumer. And so Sumudra is probably the Sumerites of the sea, of the waters. The Sumerites of the waters. That's my guess, because you have the Sumerites dispersed from here. We know they're trading with this place called Dilmun. We know they're trading with this place called Maluha, which people are like, oh, we think that's India. Well, it might be India, but it might be the whole of this region right here. That's Maluha, or the land of the flowing rivers, okay? Because it's all these rivers that are flowing down from the Himalayas, which is going to include the Hmong River Delta, and these rivers. It's not just the Ganges and the Indus River, it's all these. And we have stone that's like jade all the way up here in Mari. Which is like, well, where did they get that? Well, they could have got it from up here in Central Asia, or they could have got it down here from Southeast Asia. We don't know, but we have evidence of colonization and the jade trade from this region that seems to be antediluvian. So they seem to know that jade was down here, just like they knew that tin was over here. Okay, remember, there's 1,600 years of history before the flood. And then when we get to the story of Job, which is going to be roughly 700 years after the flood, or I'm sorry, 600 years after the flood, he's talking about in the story of Job how people will dig to the depths of the earth to find all the different rocks and minerals and precious metals and stuff like that, okay? So this was something that from the days of Tubal-Cain, which is just, I think he's like 5 generations after Cain, he masters metallurgy, okay? So you're talking about a guy just 5 generations after Cain, which could have been within 500 years up to maybe 1,500 years. And this guy's going to live for 1,000 years. So he's mastering metallurgy, which means he's mining, which means him and his sons are setting up mining operations. And they're probably, if they're over here digging for tin, it shouldn't be shocking that they're over here digging for jade. Because what they're doing is they're just following the mountains and the rivers, and they're exploring. The world is not at war. They don't have anything to be scared of. The animals aren't killing people. Remember, the fear of man doesn't come upon the animals till after the flood. So they're not in danger of animals. They're not in danger of flooding. They're not in danger of war. So they're just exploring the world, and they're getting everywhere. Okay. Well, after the flood, it's going to be largely the same for a while. Yeah, the animals are scared of man at this time, but they just run and scatter all over the place, and men chase them down with their bows and arrows and atlatls and spears, and they eat them. Okay. And that actually allows them to travel even faster because they don't have to sit and wait for crops to grow. They just chase the animals and eat those things. And then, eventually they settle in an area and make crops grow. And what we know about the Japhethites is they had horses, they had donkeys, they had mules, they had camels. And so they could transport stuff all over the place. And they're mostly migrating with either domesticated herds or hunting. That's what the Japhethites are doing. And then when they get to Oxus here, they settle in and they do some crafting. And they're growing crops, but they don't seem to be nearly as effective at that as the Hamites were, because they're digging up the stuff from before the flood, and they're going after that, and that's why they're starting Egypt. They're starting the Indus Valley Civilization. They're starting Sumer. They're starting China. They're starting Mesoamerica. And they're starting the Niger-Congo Delta. All of these are producing irrigated, agriculturally developed crops, not stuff that's just sown wild, but crops that you're actually breeding to actually make bigger and fatter and more nutritious. Okay, so we see the Hamites doing this, and of course, where are they doing this? Well, they're beelining for the river systems to do this, whereas the Japhethites are just spreading south of this ice sheet, which is providing plenty of fresh water for them, okay? Because they have fresh water coming from all around here. They're not getting the river systems. Well, once the glaciers start melting and receding, they're not getting so much fresh water coming from them anymore. And so now they have to get on the river systems, which they do, and they end up on these northern river systems like the Volga and the Dnieper and all these different river systems in the north. The Oxus is going to be right over here on the Oxus River. That's just what the Russians called it years later. But it's this Bactria-Margiana complex that's over here, okay? While the Hamites had been growing and producing a lot of agriculture on these river systems, and what you end up with is way more Hamites than everybody else. Because here's what they do. They grow crops, and then they make babies. Then they grow more crops, and then they make more babies. They're much more populous, okay? Which, if you find people in hotter places where there's just a lot more time outdoors or a lot more time indoors, a lot more time indoors because of heat or cold is what I'm saying, they're going to spend more time making babies. It's just what they're going to do. Whereas the harder your life is, the less time you're going to have to sit around and make babies. So these people are, this is why these regions are so heavily populated. This is why in India, Indonesia, I remember Just this alone is like 2/3 of humanity. Africa also, you add Africa to this, you're talking about well over half of humanity are Hamites. And this is why they have this out of Africa theory. Because the Semites are mostly here in desert, and they have kids too. But not as much as these people have kids, because it's always hot. They're always enjoying the night times, because it's cool in the night times. And quite frankly, there's a lot more sexualization in the cultures in the South. There's sexualization everywhere now, but back then, these guys were more modest. They were wearing more clothes. The desert people were wearing more clothes because this is the hot desert sun. These guys were wearing more clothes because it's cold. And these guys were just running around in their skivvies, which means a lot more sexualization is going on. And what you end up having is this trajectory of Canaanites going east. And they're bringing with them these stories. So I want to get into these flood myths now. So I did not read every one of these things, but I probably read like 75% of this. And this is 81 pages long. A lot of these get redundant, where it's very similar one over and over and over again based on where they are, but there's differences to them. And I've kind of come up with a summarized theory of these things. So there's two things going on here. One is Noah's flood. And so the original dispersion and pioneering of the world by everybody, which probably happened, honestly, they probably stayed relatively local up here in Göbekli Tepe for about a century. They probably had people going out and digging up sites. They dig up Göbekli Tepe. They probably dig up Mari and Ebla, and they probably start digging up Sumer. Noah probably starts speaking out against not reviving this stuff. The Hamites don't listen. And that's why, by the time of Noah's death, Canaan is cursed. That's why Shem is placed over the world. That's why Noah gives Shem and Japheth the prerogative of subjugating Canaan. Okay? So when he says this in the Bible, he's not just saying, I'm just going to curse Canaan because Ham made fun of me naked. Okay? That's not what's going on here. What you're having is an account of who cursed Canaan, because these people who are cursed are accounted all the way over into South America. They're like, yeah, that was the son that was cursed right there, okay? Why? Because they're descended from Canaan. They know who they are, okay? And so you have these well-known people who are cursed, and they're also the people who Abraham has promised their territory. And what Noah says in Genesis 9 is, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren, okay? He's not going to curse Canaan because of what Ham did. For all we know, Canaan wasn't even born yet when Ham did this. We don't know when this is. These are just two different things, okay? This is one story of Noah becoming drunk and Ham mocking him. But the bigger point is that Shem and Japheth took their garment, laid it both on their shoulders, went backwards and covered the nakedness of their father with their faces backwards so they saw not their father's nakedness. It's because of what they do that they get this blessing. It's the fact that Ham gets no blessing is the result of what he does. Okay? Well, what about Canaan? Well, it doesn't really say why he curses Canaan, but we know based on all the other blessings and cursings being given throughout the Bible that he's not doing this immediately afterwards. He's doing this probably on his deathbed. And so he says, blessed be the God of Shem, Canaan shall be his, or blessed be the Lord, Yahweh of Shem. Which is interesting because if Yahweh means he who is, and Shem means the name, Shamash means the name of he who is. Isn't that interesting? He says, Canaan will be a servant, and God will enlarge Japheth, and he will dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan will be his servant. So these blessings here are ultimately tied to Jesus as the Melchizedek priest, and us being in Christ, that's dwelling in the tents of Shem, and then the Canaanite religion being stamped out, which the Canaanite religion is really the Canaanite religion. Okay, it's the combination of the Canaanite religion and also the corrupted Sethite religion, which is the Nephilim religion. Okay, so the Canaanites are basically going to take all the worst things of the pre-flood world and they're going to materialize all of them. They're going to have the Nephilim. They're going to have the tablets of destiny. They're going to have all the excuses for warfare and the divination and all that weird stuff. And then Noah's going to die. So Noah lived after the flood 350 years. Then he dies. Okay, so he's going to die right around 2000, maybe 1950. It's just depends on what dating system you use. But from his death, you're going to have 250 years to the Tower of Babel, roughly. So we have a quarter century after Noah makes his decision. Within a generation, you're going to have Nimrod and Melchizedek vying for who's going to be in charge of the world. Japheth is going to step in and support Melchizedek or Shem, and he's going to help him overthrow the empire of Nimrod. And then about 150 years after that, you're going to have Hammurabi. This is after Japheth and Shem are dead. He is going to rise up and claim that he got the right to rule the world through them, and he's going to build the Tower of Babel. And when he builds the Tower of Babel, he is going to basically entice about a quarter of the whole planet to live in his region. Now, I think they estimate that there's maybe somewhere around 10 million people in the world at this time. Maybe like 25 million. But like 10 million of them live here. Now, that's still millions of people able to spread that throughout the world. And because, again, these things aren't overpopulated with lions, tigers, and bears. Okay, humans are. Remember, we started out with 6 humans and just 2 lions, tigers, and bears. Okay, so humans are not going to be threatened by animals for a very long time, and it's going to be when humans kill each other out because of warfare and disease and stuff that all of a sudden you're going to have these massive herds of animals. Now, some animals just give birth much faster than humans, but you're talking about a tiger can have a handful of cubs each year or whatever. A human can have a kid or maybe twins every year, right? So it's not like they're massively outpacing us and we got to worry about animals. We don't really have to worry about a whole lot in terms of natural disasters. We don't have to worry about anything in war. And so these people are, of course, going to get to exploring. When they can hunt and fish and they have peace with people that they can trade with for food wherever they go, they're going to explore the world. And so they get out here over these centuries and they get everywhere. Now, these are going to be a bunch of small civilizations that might have hundreds or thousands of people in them. And then larger civilizations are going to come and take them over. Like, I'm reading all this stuff about the language and the myths of China and Southeast Asia. And we know, like, in the days of Mandarin becoming the dominant language and the Hans taking over, they're going to try to get rid of and subjugate and basically erase the cultures of all these other little tribal groups, just like the Americans did when they took over the Native Americans of the U.S., okay? There's tons of these little tribal groups. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, okay? There's literally thousands of tiny little tribal groups with languages that are related but distinct and mythologies that are related but distinct. But when we read them all, they have these common elements to them. And I'm going to pull the most common elements of these things into a chart here. And it's pretty simple to see that it is all based on Noah's flood in the first place. And then there's a secondary flood we're going to talk about. Okay, and it's not really a flood. It's just the rising of the sea levels. But they think it's a flood because of the Canaanites telling them it is. Okay, so you have a global flood. And here's how we know this is a global flood. People are just like, oh, that's the Ice Ages. No, it's not. Here's how we know it's a global flood. Because you have this flood explaining these myths and these legends, explaining how all people got to where they are. Tons of them have how all people changed, how all people speak different languages attached to the flood story, just like the Bible does. But more importantly, the single most common element of the flood myths, it's not a boat, it's repopulating the world after the flood. Okay? If these were melting ice ages, humans would just be moving. They know how to make boats. They know how to float on logs. They know how to escape local floods. You wouldn't have all of these flood myths talking about, hundreds and hundreds of flood myths talking about repopulating the earth afterwards if they're just based on local floods. Even if it was a bad flood, and oh no, a bunch of people got swept down. We have those today. Oh no, 100 people died. Yeah, there's a million people surrounding those 100 that died. Like, that's not going to lead to somebody having a story about, and this is how we had to repopulate the earth and it's always this. Here's the numbers that you have associated with this. 1, 2, 4, 8, and 16. I think there might be even one with 24, okay? Well, let's look where these numbers come from. 1, that would be Noah. 2, that would be Noah and his wife. 4 would be the 4 families. 8 would be the 4 sons and their 4 wives. And 16 is actually the number of kids that Shem, Ham, and Japheth have. Okay? The total, if you add up all their kids, there's 16. Now, I think there's 24, and I want to look and see if you count the next generation, if it gets up to 24. So if you go to Genesis 10, we know the first generation is 10. And then if we go the sons of Javan, 11, 12, 13, 14. If we go these guys, we've got, let's see, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. If you exclude the sons of Joktan, which are counted, you're going to end up with, in the second generation, you're going to end up with roughly 24. I think there's a 24 in there. But again, these are spread all over the world. So it shouldn't be shocking that people have a memory of an original 8 people or an original 16 people when the literal first family, and when Shem, Ham, and Japheth get off the boat and they all have their first generation of kids, there's 16 of their kids. And it talks about an original family, original couple having 16 kids. Okay? So again, these are telephone game. These are corrupted, but it could be one man, one woman, one couple. And then there's these other versions, okay? And we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, we have 2 different kinds of flood myths, but they all talk about repopulating the earth afterwards, okay? And people are like, oh, that's because they thought their island was the whole world. No, it's not. Even if it was, they're all talking about repopulating humanity afterwards. Now, think about how humans think. We have a perfect example of this in the story of Lot and his daughters. What happens when Sodom and Gomorrah get destroyed? They think they have to repopulate the earth. Now, what would make them think that? Well, we know from Zoroastrianism and from the Bible and from Greek philosophy, there seems to have been a common belief that the earth was going to be destroyed by a fire later on, okay? So when they see their cities having fire and sulfur rain down on them, and they're in the Jordan Valley, and everything they know of is destroyed by fire, their mom was turned to a pillar of salt right before their eyes. What do you think they're thinking? This is that second judgment. This is hell. This is the end. Now we have to repopulate the earth again. That's the judge. That's the second flood of fire. That's the judgment by fire after the judgment by water. Okay? And so they think they have to repopulate the earth. And so they sleep with their father. Well, we have a second set of flood myths that are all over Southeast Asia, Oceania, and Americas that talk about either a single pregnant woman, a single man, a man and his daughter, a mother and her son, and brothers and sisters, all incestuous relationships, having to repopulate the earth. And we're going to get into where that comes from. But again, it still comes down to them repopulating the earth afterwards. Now, all the different versions of incest, and I mean there's every possible version of incest you can imagine, they're all there. Okay? So the question is, where did these all come from? But the story of them all having to repopulate the earth is so common and it's all there, okay? So now, when you get past that, the third most common element is going to be how they're saved in a vessel or taken up to heaven. The taken up to heaven is very rare. It's mostly saved in a vessel. It's mostly a boat, but sometimes it's described as a large boat, a large canoe, a large raft, a bunch of canoes tied together. these people, in their own vernacular, using their own visual elements, are trying to describe a big boat. Okay? In some cases, the shape of the boat is described. So they're going to use a vessel like a wooden mortar. Okay? A mortar and pestle is where you're going to grind herbs and stuff like that. Right? So mortar and pestle is a very old thing. Well, a wooden mortar, they're going to be like a bowl or a barrel or a coffin. These different things. Because what are they trying to describe? They're trying to describe the wooden ark. Okay? But it's most often something that's wooden. Okay? It's something that's wooden. It's a boat or a vessel. They're trying to describe the ark in their own terms. Okay? Sometimes it's a house. In the Atrahasis, it's a house. It's a boat made out of a house, basically. Probably because the ark became a house after it was a boat. That's probably why. So, the more common than the boat, though, is the fact that whatever it is ends up on a mountaintop. The boat ends up on the mountaintop, or just the people are saved by going to a mountaintop. And when they go to the mountaintop and there's no boats mentioned, they're mentioned as hiding in a cave, hanging onto trees, or just being on the top of the mountain to save themselves. Okay? That's because there's a second kind of flood that had to do with the rising sea levels. But all of them have the mountaintop. And then the ones who have the sea levels and the incest, they're in Southeast Asia, Oceania, and America. The trajectory that the Canaanites would have went from west to east, okay? So we see the incest among all of them. Why? We know from the Bible that the Canaanites practiced incest. We also know from the story of Lot that people would have practiced incest out of fear. We also know from the days of Moses that all these incestuous practices God was not happy with. Okay? So what's going on? Well, did the Jews practice incest? Well, we know they did because Aaron's and Moses' dad marries his aunt, which could have been a younger aunt that's his age, but she's his aunt. And maybe it's a half aunt. Maybe it's an aunt from a later wife. That's possible. Abraham marries his half-sister. Jacob marries two sisters. All of these things are expressly forbidden in the law, and it's described in Leviticus 18 that these are the things that the Canaanites do, which is causing the land to vomit them out. So God's saying he hates these things, okay? But the Jews practiced them. Well, the Jews also worshipped idols in Egypt, okay? So the Jews were influenced by the Canaanites. They were intermarrying with them before Moses, and it's after Moses that it's forbidden for them to intermarry with them anymore or practice their practices. So God suffered their ignorance, and now he's like, okay, you need to wake up and follow the right stuff, okay? So apparently the taboo of incest is understood throughout the whole earth. Now, Abraham marries his half-sister, and maybe that's not considered so taboo because, again, that's a sister from another mother. Maybe that's not considered incest, but definitely a full-on brother, sister, father, daughter, mother, son. These are all considered wrong. And this is why you have these stories mentioning this incest with a kind of consequence to the incest. And a very, very common one, for instance, if you go into Southeast America or Southeast Asia, is how the woman can't give birth to children, so she gives birth to a gourd instead. We'll talk about where that comes from in a minute. But that is common. Also very common and spread throughout the globe is birds sent out as a test to see if there's land. It is very common almost wherever you have birds mentioned, you have a dove or a bird like a dove, and then another bird that's known for eating dead flesh, like a raven or a vulture or a hawk, okay? You have a carrion bird and then another bird that's not a carrion bird, okay? Like a seed-eating bird or a bug-eating bird. And why are you doing that? Well, the carrion-eating bird is going to go around. He's going to find flesh to eat. He's going to find dead carcasses to eat because they're floating to the surface as, stuff's dying all over the world, okay? He's not going to come back. So he has to try with another bird because that bird's not going to come back because he can find flesh to eat everywhere, okay? Now, it could be he's deliberately trying to wait till all the dead flesh is gone before he departs, but it looks like he's sending out this bird to that he knows can survive on dead flesh, but the bird never comes back because there's so much dead flesh to eat. And he eventually sends out the dove, and the dove comes back with an olive branch, which is what a bird would do who needs to nest. It's going to go grab branches and stuff to build a nest so it can have its nest and lay eggs, okay? So he's using these animals by their nature to figure out, where the land is. Well, this bird test is everywhere. And I mean, it's not in every last myth, but it's in every corner of the globe, okay? And then we also find, not as prominent, but also in every corner of the globe, the sacrifice and the rainbow. Now, sometimes the rainbow is described as a rainbow serpent because that was one of the ways they described like Quetzalcoatl, the serpent god. But you have a rainbow associated afterwards. What you do not have anywhere but in the biblical story is God's promise to never flood the world again. That is unique to the Bible. And the reason I believe it is unique to the Bible is because you would have had a strong oral tradition dating back to Noah to keep track of this, and probably a written language to write down the specific promise. Okay? And most of the written languages were not there until after the flood. So you have the Mosaic tradition, which is going to come from Melchizedek or Shem, and then in the Proto-Hebrew language it's going to be written when they're in Egypt. You have the Egyptians with a record of the flood, and Ra sending the flood. You have the Sumerians with a record of the flood. But they have different rationales for why the flood happened. The Egyptians account him sending the flood to give the world rest, which Noah's name means rest. And the flood basically is accounted as changing the world's topography and creating the mountains and the rivers and the rains and all this stuff. You didn't have that before the flood. You had the earth mostly uniform, but when you have the fountains of the deep bursting forth from the earth, it apparently is breaking things up. It's causing the mid-ocean ridges, which are probably just lava, volcanic stuff, backfilling the crack where the waters came out of. You honestly probably have somewhat of a physical expansion of the earth. You have basically these waters getting thrown up into the mountaintops, which are going to freeze and become glacial ices. You have the ice age from God blowing the wind across the earth. And I'm going to show you this. This is actually a well-documented thing. It's called the 4.2 kiloyear event. Okay, you look this up on Wikipedia. Now, these people aren't going to cop to this being part of the flood, but they're just like, why are we saying there's a 4.2 kiloyear event? Because we find these destructions or abandonments of all these civilizations around when's 4.2 kiloyears from now? Oh, that's around 2200 BCE. And you have these ranges of different evidences between 2200 BCE, 2300 BCE, 2250 BCE. Well, what's in 2300 BCE? The flood. Okay? Well, what happens after the flood? Well, God tells you what happens after the flood. He says, "And God remembered Noah and every living thing, and the cattle that was in the ark, and he made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged." So a big wind's coming across the earth, pushing the waters away, just like it did in the Red Sea. Okay, that's how the waters are being pushed off the surface of the earth. They're eventually freezing. Some are eventually draining back into the earth, into crevices and spaces that now have rock layers on top of them. And that's why you have artesian wells and stuff. Like, I actually used to live in a house with an artesian well. It was up in the UP in Michigan, and literally you had to put a little hole in the fountain in your well because it was just always shooting out water. Basically, the pressure of the rock plate sitting on the water beneath the earth was constantly causing water to come up. And they have one of these in Jerusalem. It's talked about, Hezekiah's tunnel and their fountains that are there. These are all over the earth because those are waters that drained into these crevasses after the flood. And then as the rock layers settled on them, well, they're kind of suspended by these rock layers, and wherever that rock's finding a little place for water to go up, it's forcing water to push up like a straw. Okay? So we also have this wind that is accounted passing over the earth in other myths too. So if you just go into this list and you look at wind, in the Lithuanian version of this myth, it says, from this heavenly window, the supreme god, so notice we have the windows of heaven, the supreme god Pranzimus saw nothing but war and injustice among mankind. He sent two giants, Wandu and Weja, water and wind, to destroy the earth. After 20 days and night, little was left. Pranzimus looked to see the progress. He happened to be eating nuts at the time, and he threw down the shells. One happened to land on the peak of the tallest mountain, where some people and animals had sought refuge. Everybody climbed in and survived the flood floating in the nutshell. God's wrath abated, and he ordered the wind and the water to abate. He ordered the wind and the water to abate. The people dispersed, except for one elderly couple who stayed where they landed. To comfort them, God set a rainbow and advised them to jump over the bones of the earth 9 times. They did so, and up sprang 9 other couples, from which the Lithuanian tribes are descended. What are the 9 other couples? I don't know. Japheth had 7 kids, so maybe it's Japheth and his wife, and then the 7 kids, and then Noah and his wife, and there's the 9 couples. I don't know. I really don't know. But the point is, this is a Lithuanian creation myth, okay? So we see the wind and the water abating. That's the Hebrew, so that's the Bible. This is a Persian myth. It says, in early times, the earth was full of malign creatures fashioned by the evil Ahriman. So there's your Nephilim. Probably their records of dinosaurs and giant creatures as well. And it says the angel Tistar, the star Sirius, descended 3 times in the form of a man, the whole horse, and a bull, respectively, causing 10 days and nights of rain each time. Each raindrop became as big as a bowl, and the water rose to the height of a man over the whole earth. So the whole earth is diluted to the height of a man, okay? Why is it saying to the height of a man? Well, what does the Bible say? The Bible says it went to 18 feet over the earth. It's cubits, I think it's measuring, okay? Well, it's basically taller than the biggest Nephilim. Because if it was just to the height of the Nephilim, these Nephilim would get to the top of the mountains and they would survive. They might have to eat fish or whatever, but they'd survive, okay? They've got fresh water, they've got fish. And this is why you have Sasquatches and Yetis up in the mountains. These are the ghosts of these Nephilim who tried to get to the mountains and escape, okay? This was a common thing. Now, it says the first flood drowned the creatures, but the dead noxious creatures went into holes in the earth. Okay, well, what are these? The dead noxious creatures, these are probably the souls of these creatures. These creatures that are drowned are probably the Nephilim. Then it says, before returning to cause the second flood, Tistar, in the form of a white horse, battled the demon Aposhoa, who took the form of a black horse. Ormuzd blasted the demon with lightning, making the demon give a cry, which can still be heard in thunderstorms, and Tistar prevailed and caused the rivers to flow. The poison washed from the land by the second flood made the seas salty. Okay? So notice this is Persian. Now let's look at our map here. You can see the depth of the Caspian Sea. These are the seas that would be near Persia, okay? So here's Persia. Right here. Now the Caspian Sea was always salty because it probably wasn't a sea before the flood. It was probably just a valley, and it's going to get filled in with salt water from the flood, and it's just going to be a valley. But the Black Sea seemed to have been a freshwater lake underneath, okay? And when this second flood happens, or the raising of the sea levels, that's what this is, you're going to have the ocean. See how this is all blocked off? It's going to fill in these gaps and allow salt water to come in to the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and then, again, these are forming as seas for the first time. They're never fresh waters. And then the Mediterranean and the Black Sea are going to be filled in with fresh water. They have deeper portions that may have been fresh water at one point in time, because again, these would have been valleys that were filled in by river running down into them. Okay, so if any of these things were anything, they were freshwater lakes, and then the flood came and left salt water behind. Well, then you have other ones who are deepened by salt water and filled in after the fact. Because these saltwater systems are eventually going to be overflowed by river water again, but if then the sea levels rise and they're able to connect with the oceans, then they're going to have even more salt water in them. Okay. So he talks about how there's the second flood and the rivers became salty. Now, he doesn't mention the third flood, probably because the third flood is the flood of fire. Because remember, this is the Persians, and the Persians believe in the flood of fire per Zoroastrianism, okay? So we have Noah's flood, which is basically causes the destruction of all the animals and the destruction of the Nephilim. And then the second flood, which it just says, Tistar, in the form of a white horse, battled the demon Aposhoa, which took the form of a black horse. Ormuzd blasted the demon with lightning and made the demon give a cry. I would imagine whoever these guys are, this is an angel, Ormuzd. I haven't looked up all these myths yet, but I imagine this is probably based around the battle to dislodge Nimrod's empire. And then the guy blasting him with lightning would probably have something to do with Yahweh appearing as a storm god, or Yahweh appearing as in the whirlwind, becoming in their minds the storm god, and that's probably who Ormuzd is. And then it says he's giving a cry which is still heard in the thunderstorm, so they would remember him attacking this demon and winning. And then it says Tistar prevailed and caused rivers to flow. So notice it's not saying a great rain like before. It's the rivers to flow, and that's the second flood that makes things salty. It says the waters were driven to the ends of the earth by a great wind and became the sea Vorushkasha, wide gulf. So let's see if Vorushkasha is the Black Sea. Vorushkasha is a mythical cosmic sea in Zoroastrian mythology, not a physical sea. I don't think that's true. It could be the ocean. But again, these are primordial myths, so they're going to say, oh, this is all mythological. Nothing of this comes from anything literal. That's a lot of stuff that's in the Bible. So maybe it does, okay? Now, that's the only one that's a really clear wind. You have this other one. This is central Siberia. It says floodwaters rose for 7 days. Some people and animals were saved by climbing on floating logs and rafters. A strong wind blew for 7 days and scattered the people, which is why there are different people speaking different languages. So there's a lot of references to a wind blowing the people to their different lands, especially in the sea, which this great wind probably something happened where it started or stopped or got more pronounced in the Tower of Babel, and different people probably thought the flood was coming again, and they were scattering and hiding. And when they came out, people were speaking different languages. That there seems to have been a wind or a storm associated with the Babel event, okay, worldwide. So notice the names we have. In the Altaic, we have the name is Nama, that's Noah's wife. Just like Nuwa is a feminine in Chinese, Nama, that's Noah's wife. And it says, Tengiz, the sea, was once lord over the earth. Nama, a good man, lived during the rule with his 3 sons, Sozanul, Sarul, and Belkis. Ogun commanded Nama to build an ark. Kerep, and Nama's sight was failing, so he left the building to his sons. The ark was on a mountain, and there hung 80-fathom cables from which to gauge the water depth. Nama entered the ark with his family and various animals and birds that had been driven there by rising waters. 7 days later, the cables gave way from the earth, showing that the flood had risen 80 fathoms. 7 days later, Nama told his eldest son to open the window and look around. The son saw only summits of mountains. His father ordered him to look again later. He saw only water and sky. At last, the ark stopped on a group of 8 mountains. On successive days, Nama released a raven, a crow, and a rook, none of which returned. On the 4th day, he sent out a dove, which returned with a branch of a twig, and told why the other birds hadn't returned. They had found carcasses of a deer, a dog, and a horse, respectively, and had stayed to feed on them. In anger, Nama cursed them to behave thus to the end of the world. When Nama became very old, his wife exhorted him to kill all the men and animals he had saved, so that they transferred to the other world would be under his power. Nama didn't know what to do. Sozan-Ul, who didn't dare oppose his mother openly, told his father a story about seeing a blue-black cow devouring a human, so that only the legs were visible. Nama understood the fable and cleft his wife in two with a sword. Finally, Nama went to heaven, taking with him Sozan-Ul and changing him into a constellation of the 5 stars. What? This is a Siberian myth, okay? But you see how many pieces of the Noah legend are in there, including the name Nama, which is Noah's wife. Okay, so again, we're going to have these stories endlessly around the world, and this is where we're going to talk about the second one, okay? What is the second one? Well, we know that the Canaanites are spreading the myth of these 600-year cycles and the flood returning. Why? I can't figure out exactly where this 600-year theory first pops up, but it seems to pop up before the Tower of Babel is built. It seems to be the idea that gets the people to cease fearing Yahweh and then believe that the flood is a natural event or maybe a supernatural event, but just happens as dictated by the stars periodically and not because of our moral wickedness from a personal God, okay? And so Hammurabi seems to be building this big waterproof tower as flood insurance, and that's why he's so popular, and that's why so many people dwell near to him in his flood, because they think when the flood happens, it's not going to be this overnight thing. You're going to have a week to get to where you need to get to before the floodwaters are so high that you're toast, okay? And so a quarter of the world is dwelling near this because of the fear of a second flood. They're using this cult, which is telling them the floods are going to come back every 600 years, to keep the world close to himself. And this is why God disperses the world with the Tower of Babel. Okay? Now, we know because in the Atrahasis, which was written right after this, they write down the 600-year cycles. And we know that Ziusudra, or I'm sorry, not Ziusudra, but Enlil in the Atrahasis every 600 years keeps trying to destroy humanity because they're getting too populated. Then we know a similar story pops up. So the Atrahasis is written right over here. Well, in the Yima myth, right over here, we have Ahura Mazda complaining that the world is overpopulated every 300 years. So this is probably influenced by this. And of course, we have Zoroaster responding to these priests that are corrupting everything, which is probably based on the Canaanite priests. So we know the Sinaites are probably traveling through here, mixing with the Oxus people. They're going to travel north and mix in with Mongols and become the northern Chinese people, along with the Native Americans. We know the Zemarites are primarily going to travel south, but probably some Sinaites with them. And they're going to come around Rama and Shiva, which are basically your Indian peoples who have their territories mostly marked out on the river systems connecting to the ocean. So when they get around them, they might find some people they can trade from. They might find someone to kidnap a wife from. But they're mostly trying to keep them moving because they speak a different language than these people. And probably people are chucking spears at them and stuff. Okay? And so they get around to here where you have probably people Sumatra. If these are the Sumerites of the Zemarites of the waters, you would have these ocean levels rising, and you see where the people are consolidating back towards here, Sumatra. And this is why, again, this is Indonesia and Sumatra, these regions over here, become super densely populated because you once had more scattered people here in these lowlands, probably with river systems flowing down from them, who all push their way back up in the highlands as the sea levels rise, and these things just get more and more densely populated. But what you have after that is these sealand peoples who come in here and take over and sack Babylon. Now, people are like, oh, these are these tiny little tribes who are just hanging out in the marshlands like hillbillies. They always think just because we don't have detailed records on these people, they were just some small little insignificant tribe of hillbillies who just came and overthrew the most powerful city in the world. I don't know why they're so dumb. Even with the Tower of Babel incident or an empire going in decline, some hillbillies from the sticks aren't just going to come into their capital and overthrow it with no resistance. They have to be a powerful people. They have to have connections to weaponry. They have to have connections to food and supply chain to back up what they're doing. It's never, oh, the Amorites were just these hicks who were just hanging around and they overthrew everything. No, they weren't. These were connected people, okay? So who is the Sealand dynasty connected to? Probably the Sumerites of the sea down in here, okay? And what probably happened is when these guys left here and they went down here and they got to here and they said, blah, 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 there's a big confusion of languages and this empire's falling apart now. They're like, well, let's go take it over. And these guys come back here and they become the Sealand dynasty and they're going to rule for like the next 300 years. Makes sense Makes more sense that the people called the Sea Land Dynasty actually came from the sea and not from the swamps that were only existing. These marshlands only existed because the irrigation of the Sumerians fell apart. That's why they're marshlands, okay? They weren't natural marshlands that were sitting here on a desert on the Persian Gulf between two rivers. They were there because these people were very industrially irrigating between these two rivers to create these systems. And then when they stopped taking care of them, they quickly became marshlands and swamps when everything just overgrew and they all got washed in and they basically became swamps, okay? So the Sea Land peoples, I think, came from Sumatra. That's my opinion. Which makes sense because these people are then dealing with overpopulation as everyone's moving into the highlands and their regions are now getting overcrowded. Well, one of them, the one nearest to here, says, hey, we know how to sail in boats because we've been doing this as the sea levels have been rising. People are getting trapped down here in Australia with their marsupials, the koalas, and the kangaroos and stuff like this. But you see how they were once connected by land bridges. And then these people just, as the sea levels are rising, are just getting better and better with boats and stuff like this. And since the Sumerians are super great with astrology, the connection of these two people leads to these people being able to sail the seas really freaking good. And so what they end up doing is they start sailing all these seas and getting to the oceans and stuff like this. Well, what they're finding when they get to these various islands and stuff all over the place is people who were isolated when these islands were once connected going, hey, how did you guys get here? Well, the sea levels rose and we ran up into the highlands. Why? Because the Canaanites are spreading around all over the place that there's going to be another flood coming. So when these people are seeing for the first time monsoon rains and the sea levels rising, what do you think they're thinking? This is the next global flood. It's 600 years. This is the next global flood. And so they're running into the hills. And what you probably have happening is just like you have crazy rapture people who go underground or get rid of all their money and go wait on the hilltops. You have these little culty groups that do stuff like this. You probably had stuff just like that back then where people were just like, the flood's coming, grab your kids and run, okay? Just like Lot with his daughters, you have all these stories of a guy with his daughter, a woman with her son, a pregnant woman, a brother and sister all alone, a father with their brother and sister, isolated up in the mountains. Well, there wasn't a global flood, but what did happen is they got isolated in mountains that then became islands when all this filled in. And so you have all of these islands in Southeast Asia, between Australia and stuff like this, which may have been once populated by a pregnant woman, by a man and his daughter, by a brother and sister, by a father with his two kids. I mean, literally some of these stories is like a woman was pregnant and she was the sole survivor of the flood and she prayed that her husband would be a boy, and he was a boy, and when he grew up, he married her, and that's who repopulated the world. Well, it's probably not who repopulated the world, but it might have been who populated that island. And so you'll have people in these different island groups where it's literally like they all look alike. And I don't mean like they all look alike like they're all from 20 different families. I mean they all look alike like clones. Well, that's because they all came from a mother and her son. Okay? So the boys look like what dad looked like, and the girls look like what mom looked like. 100% over, and then they just keep interbreeding, and then they just keep being the same. And as long as they don't have any bad genes or Nephilim genes or anything crazy that's going to make them corrupt and fall apart, they're just going to look crazy alike, okay? They all got the same smile. They all got pretty much the same everything over there. And you have every possible variation of incest story with this. And not only do you have these here, you have these in the other major place where you're going to have these, and that's in North America over here. Notice you have the mountain ranges over here, right? Well, again, you see how you have these sea levels, which are, it's going to make North America a little bigger on the west coast, but not much, but the Bering Straits are going to disappear, okay? Well, when the Bering Straits disappear, these people are trapped over here. And when they see the ocean levels rise to the point that the Bering Straits are disappearing, they're heading for the mountains because they're like, crap, we're heading for the mountains. And so you have a very common myth over here of something about a man marrying a dog. This is going to be the next most common version of this. You're going to have somebody marrying a snake that turns into a man, or a crab that turns into a man, or a god or an angel that comes down and impregnates them, or a dog that turns into a woman. It's some story of an animal that turns into a human. Well, there's a couple of different reasons for this. First of all, we have a story of a woman being raped by a giant here. We have a story of these creatures who were destroyed before the flood. We have cave paintings all over the world of bestiality and phalluses. Animals with phalluses are half animal, half humans, with phallus imagery, like you have at Göbekli Tepe, in cave paintings scattered all over the world. So these people are finding these things, and they're coming up with their own origin stories. That's one version that's probably legitimate. The other version that is probably legitimate is because they are ashamed of the fact that, I slept with my mom, I slept with my sister, and this is where we all came from. Again, Island of the Blue Lagoon, you guys. It's just like you trap a brother and sister on an island, and they hit puberty. Like, they're gonna do it. That's just gonna happen, okay? They're gonna do it. And they're not gonna be like, but you're my brother. Like, they haven't known any other people for 5 years, and they're just like alone with their hormones. They're gonna do it, okay? So what do you end up with? You end up with these stories, and probably an original was a man and his dog and his 2 kids who survived. That's probably original. And then the brother and sister marry and merge, okay? Now, they are not surviving. What they are is probably some crazy dad who takes his kids and goes into an isolated mountain region because he thinks the world's going to flood, because he believed this stupid-ass Canaanites that were passing through, because they're going to pass through all the way down here. In fact, even when you get all the way down here in South America, these people down here in southeast Brazil say these people up here in the mountains who practice human sacrifice were the sons of, they're descended from the guy who was cursed. That this guy had 2 sons and one of them was cursed, and they're descended from him. So who do you think these people are? Oh, they're Canaanites, okay? So you have Canaanites among the Incas and among the Mayas and the Olmecs and the Aztecs. All these people who practice human sacrifice were either taught it by the Canaanites or are the Canaanites, okay? And so the people who are downhill from them, they've got their own pagan corruptions too, but what they're not doing is killing people to appease the gods of the sun and the solstice and astrological calendar, because they're following the long count calendar and they're sacrificing people. That's Canaanite stuff, okay? And this stuff's going on, but these people are traveling around, and when they're spreading around their myths, it's kind of like the guy who's like, there's going to be a rapture in 2012 because 2012 was when the Mayan calendars are going, and you're like, bull crap. But then there's that guy who's just like, I don't know, there are a lot of floods kind of happening in the world in 2012, and now there's forest fires breaking out too. And then there's that guy who's a little bit more unhinged than him, who has some time to build a bunker. And then there's the guy who's a little bit more unhinged who's him, who becomes John Goodman on Cloverfield Lane and takes some girl down there, and she's like his daughter or something like that. And he's like, I'm just trying to save you. And then he ends up banging her. Okay? So because we have the story of Lot and his daughters, we know that human beings were that dumb. We know human beings had end-of-the-world beliefs that led them to commit incest when they knew incest was wrong, okay? If they didn't believe incest was wrong, they wouldn't have gotten their father drunk to sleep with him, okay? We know they know incest is wrong. We know they think it's the end of the world and they got to commit incest to repopulate the earth. So it shouldn't be shocking that all over here, where you have all these, this basically continent reduced to islands, and these continents were probably super lush. I mean, if you've been to like Papua New Guinea or something like that, there's a reason these people ain't trying to build no technology. They just got lush valleys and wild fruit growing wherever, and when they get hungry and they want to go hunt for a boar or whatever, they're just like, let's get some bacon. And they get some bacon. The rest of the time they're eating bananas. They're just growing all around. They're good, right? That's probably what these lands were like. They were probably super lush. These people just basically sat around making babies, occasionally going hunting and carrying out crazy rituals. Maybe killing and eating people once in a while, because that kind of stuff was going on there too. But for the most part, they're just wandering around and eating. They're doing good, okay? And then all this stuff fills in, and it's a lot more sparse, but it's still super lush, okay? Island living is not bad, especially when you got wild boars going around. You can have bacon to go with your plantains every now and again. But when these floods come in and these fill in these gaps, these people only know how to do a couple things: hunt, fish, and have sex. That's all they know how to do. And they're like, and I'm all out of fish. I'm all out of, like, it's like, it's all they know how to do. And so what do? Every form of incest, and then their island gets repopulated by incest. And what you end up having is a lot of these cultures who do this stuff end up, because again, this is going to happen gradually, but probably a lot quicker than you think, not over thousands of years. And these guys are going to get pushed up into Southeast Asia, a lot of them. So that's why you have a whole bunch of different groups here. And then you're going to have other people who eventually make it over by boat up here. And so you have just tons of different language groups up in here and up in India. Okay? They're all the people who are escaping this area and moving north as the sea levels were rising. Because some of the first stuff to rise and fill in was Australia. That was cut off right off the bat, which is why the Aborigines never figured out how to make a boat and get out. But the rest of this was probably gradual. You have people living inland on China, moving upriver. You have people separated on Japan and becoming much more sophisticated. And then you have people going on into North America, and they're mostly people following the caribou and the mammoths and different stuff and eating whatever they can find, the buffalo, and they're mostly hunter-gatherers because you're just healthier if you just eat meat all the time. And so these guys would eat meat all the time, hang around the fire, and they just run around with their spears and they just stab stuff and eat it, and they're good. They're good, okay? And then these other guys come. Now, one of these legends that talk about where people came from, you have these different legends that talk about where the different colors of people came from. And the reason is because as these people are isolating by language, they're also isolating by genetics, which means all of these people who are probably mostly mixed black, brown, yellow into a pretty common skin tone, similar to what you see in Polynesia or Oceania. You know, you're going to see these mixtures of Asiatic and features that could be like, could that be a Mexican, or could that be a Chinese person, or, you know, not a whole lot of like black African among these people, but you probably had some mix of them too, much more in India. But the point is a lot of similarities to moving back up here where people are much more distinct, okay? And so among these legends here, you have a myth of a woman who's pregnant and she marries her kid. You have a myth of a brother and sister who marry, and one of them gives birth to a gourd because they're cursed, because they're not supposed to marry their brother and sister. And out of the gourd come 3 kids. And one of the 3 kids, she gives birth to a gourd, and the first thing she tries to do is cook it and eat it. Now this might be related to where the Canaanites are like roasting their babies in the fire to Molech. I don't know. But she tries to cook gourd and eat it, and then realizes there's kids in there, and so she starts pulling kids out of a hole in the gourd. And because she tried to cook it first, the gourd's all covered with ash, and the first kid coming out has a lot of ash on him, and so he becomes ashy. He's the black guy, okay? Then she has another kid coming out with about half as much ash, and he becomes the brown guy, and then another kid come out with no ash, and he's the white guy, okay? Well, this is your basic designation between South Africa or South India, which are Kushites, up to China. And between them are the Tibetans, which are kind of reddish, okay? Southern China is more reddish too. The guys in Southeast Asia can be a mix. Obviously, it's changed a lot over the centuries, as you were talking about thousands of years ago. But the basic designation is black, brown, white. Just like you have between Egypt and Greece, for instance, black, brown, white, right? This is a common designation. And then the yellowish people were the Canaanites, which, you know, again, they're going to be seen as white people compared to black and brown people, okay? You have the same thing over here in America, where this guy talks about how there used to be 3 different peoples among them. There used to be red people. They describe them as white people with hairy heads, white people with hair all over their bodies, and red people, okay? These are the 3 kinds of people, okay? So the white people with hair on their heads, those are your Mongoloid people who don't have any body hair, okay? Your white people with hair all over would be your Japhethites, your more straight up Indo-European peoples with more hair. You're going to have people like that. We know they have red-haired giants, supposedly. They're not really giants, but your Germanic peoples, they're pretty big, okay? So there are apparently Germanic peoples who are once among them, are people who are the descendants of the people who became the Scots and Celts and stuff like that, who are among them, because we have these reddish-haired humans, they're not giant. They're like 6 feet tall, but to them might be giant. Well, if I were to go to Germany, I'm like maybe 5'9". I was probably 5'11", and when before I started shrinking with my old fatness, and when I went to Germany in college, it's like these guys were towering over me. I just felt small, being around all these Germans. They're big, okay? The Germans, the Dutch, the Norse, they're all super tall, okay? Well, if some of these people were once upon a time mixed with these people, it said they went down to where there were no food or resources and stuff, and they eventually died out there, okay? So these guys stayed up here hunting the caribou. These guys came down here and eventually were these red-haired giants that died. And then they said the red-haired people moved down, who brought culture with them, moved down south, and those are probably the Canaanites, okay? So again, these legends are held by Native American tribes that live up here, along with the ones with a guy and two kids and his dog. Then the guy and the 2 kids and the dog thing become a guy and his dog, where the dog turns into a woman and he marries her, okay? Now, some of this probably has some Nephilim mix in it, but some of it is probably just like, where did the people come from if there was just a guy with 2 kids? And someone's like, he had his dog. His dog was a woman and turned into a dog. His dog was a dog, but it turned into a woman. And like, they're just making stuff up with the details that they have, because they have made the mistake of taking this one story of where this one tribe came from and turning it into the flood myth of where all people came from. And that's what you have in most of these stories. You have the one story of this incestuous couple, mother, daughter, 2 brothers and sisters, wherever, where this one island full of people came from, or this one mountain tribe came from. And instead of saying, yeah, those are some weird people who believe stupid Canaanite lies and went and became hillbillies, they instead choose to believe that that's where all people came from, because they're merging and conflating this flood myth with the Noah flood myth. That's what's happening all over the world. So remember, this post-flood sea levels, you have a 600-year period for human beings to multiply and populate. The time it takes for the Israelites and their servants, which is probably the thousands, to turn to millions is about 240 years, okay? So the time it takes, the 70 sons of Japheth to turn into millions, shouldn't shock you, is about 600 years. You just do the math on it. It's like, if they can turn 70 people into 2 million in 250 years, well, what can you do with twice that time, or 2.5 times that? And the answer is exponential that up, and you're going to be up to probably like 10, 25 million. So you're going to have half of them here. You're going to have the other half, largely a lot of them here. They're mostly in Africa. There's some settlements here, and then they're going to explode after that and keep growing and growing and growing. The people with less warfare are going to grow more. The people with more readily available food resources and similar languages around them and less warfare are going to grow the fastest. And so you're going to have a lot of growth among the Hamites. Over here, you're going to have a lot of conflict, but you're still going to have growth because there's just a ton of people over here. Over here, you're going to have a lot less conflict, but you're going to have growth. The African tribes, I'm sure you have war and enslaving among them, but you just have this huge continent where they can just keep spreading out from conflict, okay? And that's why you have tons of little language groups where they're all isolated, but they're related. But there's really like 3 or 4 language groups across this whole continent. There's really probably only 3 or 4 language groups across this whole continent, and then a bunch of variations of them. And whenever you have a conflict, the tribe splits and they move over, and then eventually your language shifts over the century. It's the same basic language group that it's related to. But you essentially have Sinaites, Canaanites, Japhethite Sinite mix, and then just straight up Japhethites who are here. Like, we know in 1700 there was this Louisiana, it's called like Poverty Hill or something like that, Poverty Point in Louisiana, where they have this like stadium seating set up here in 1700. So by the time of the Tower of Babel, there was apparently this meeting place here, and there's all mound cultures and stuff. Some of this stuff's pre-flood, but some of it's post-flood. So there's a lot of stuff there in terms of culture, and then it just got split up by the Tower of Babel. But it wasn't a ton of language groups here. It wasn't a ton of language groups here, but the general trajectory of Canaanites towards the east led to a lot of languages and a lot of people in these regions. Because the Canaanites came from here, and most of them just kept spreading to the east afterward. You have Rama and Shiva spreading to the east. You also, as the ice caps are receding, you're having the Japhethites who have horses now going to the south of these mountains because it's not too hard to get from river to river, and they're eventually going to get up here, and they're going to come down through these mountains, and they're going to get up into here and become the Mongoloid peoples and kind of settle in there. And then by the time the Chinese come, they're meeting them, they're raiding them, they're kidnapping wives, they're eventually becoming more Chinese looking because of that. Whereas the Magogites who move over here, they're doing that and kidnapping wives from the Thracians, and so they're going to end up looking like Scotsmen. Okay? They're all related to each other, but they're going to look like the people they kidnap wives from or trade for wives. They're not always necessarily kidnapping them, but we know from the Mongols onward that, even Native Americans, whatever, grabbing women and kidnapping women and taking them off on your horses, and you can never find them again because they've driven 100 miles away on a horse. That's a common thing. And so we see these people doing this, and what do? They isolate these people into their cave, and they're like, this is where you're going to stay. I'll kill you if you try to leave. And you eventually make babies with those people. And then your kids are going to look like the babies of the people who you're kidnapping wives from more than they're going to look like you eventually. Okay? So what you end up having is these Hamitic, predominantly largest populations, being kidnapped or dominating. So, for instance, the Egyptians dominate the Greeks for a while. The Hittites dominate the Japhethites over here. The Indians are going to be probably largely breeding with the dominant Japhethites after the Vedic invasion. The Sinites are going to be up in here, and the Mongols are probably going to be kidnapping them and mingling with them for a time. Not all this needs to be warfare and kidnapping. It can be just peaceful trade and co-marriages. But they're going to mix together, and they're going to, but the point is you're going to end up with a lot more Hamitic genes all throughout these peoples because the Japhethites are having less kids probably. They're still having a fair amount, but they're spread out a lot further because of the horses. They're spreading as far as these ice sheets can take them as it goes up, and they just keep going up with the ice sheets until it's too cold. And even when it's too cold, you have people who live up here who have these little short-haired horses, and they can just ride these horses like the wind. Like I've seen them on modern YouTube videos, where it's like these little ponies that can just go, 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 and they have long hair on, and they just run through the blizzards. It's amazing. These people just keep moving north, and they love it up north because nobody messes with you up north. Nobody wants to go up where it's cold. And then if you got horses, you're down here, and you're just running amok, and you go down here and rape and pillage, and then you come back with their horses, and they can never get you. You have the Persian Empire that's like huge, and they're covering all this. And then the Scythians come down, and they make a mess, and then they leave, and these guys, they do the thing. They're just like, we're just going to spread out your supply line, then pick off your supply line, then kill your armies, then loot your stuff. That's what we do. So these guys are going to spread, but their genes are going to thin out, where these guys are going to be dense, and their genes are going to be repopulated in this. And that's why they have the so-called out of Africa theory. And some of the most Hamitic among them, and some of the most widespread genes among them, are going to be the Zemarite genes, the Kushite genes, and probably the Puntite genes, because the Puntite genes are the earliest seafaring people from over here that would have gotten over here. Okay? And these Puntites, which are basically your Somalians, Eritreans, seem to come from Punt, and then your Bantu people seem to come from Punt. These guys are sailing your Kushites and your Zemarites back and forth. They're probably intermarrying with them, and then they probably go over here and isolate themselves to form this Niger-Congo civilization. And then these guys become a very dense isolation of the genetics that eventually are widespread all over here. And so that's why they assume the out of Africa theory of Y chromosomal atom being from here. That's why the crazy theory comes out. Okay? Because the same genes that are over here in a more concentrated amount are dispersed throughout here, and all the way up into here. Makes sense, doesn't it? So that's the story of the flood. There's two floods. All you got to remember is there's a true global flood and then rising sea levels that happened around 1700 that freak people out into thinking there's a second flood. And to their worldview, there was a second flood. If you lived down in here and all around here and all around here, where quite a few people probably lived, or up around here, there was a second flood. I mean, it was like we used to be able to get over there, and now we can't because of a flood. So it's natural when these people don't have written languages, and they're going to merge these stories together about some people having to repopulate the whole earth after the flood, where these two stories are going to merge together. But we do have multiple cultures that keep track of two floods. So we have the second flood in Persia. We also have a second flood among this tribe called the Joshua tribe. In Oregon. So this is going to be West Coast, which makes sense. They're going to be seeing rising sea levels in Oregon on the Pacific Ocean. And then you're going to also have another one among the Blackfeet tribe in Alberta, Montana. So it says, the sun, the moon, and their two children, old man and Epistotoki god, began creating the world. They were given sandstone water to hide, and the hide of a fisher with which to complete the creation. The flood came. They could only save those four things. Later, they created an old man, a dog, a man, and a woman. So you see the myth of it's a father with his dog and his old child. After the second flood, only those four were left on the earth, and they created the rest of the world. See? So notice he says it's after a second flood. They were giving sandstone water and the hide of a fisher to complete the creation. A flood came, and they could only save those four things. What is that about? I don't know. Sun, moon, and the old man. This is probably honestly based on the deification of Noah and whatever. And then you have a second flood. So we go up to the Joshua tree one. It says, in the beginning there was no land, so Zawalki, the giver, and his companion lived in a sweat house on the water. One day white land appeared and expanded on the waters. Zawalki made it solid by blowing tobacco smoke on it. He made it more solid in the land by dropping 5 mud cakes into the ocean and telling them to expand when they hit the bottom. When he stepped on the new land, it became solid. He looked for sand on the new land and saw the man's tracks, seemingly coming from the north and leading into water in the south. This worried him, but he told the water to overflow the land he had created from the mud and to recede again. But he found more tracks again coming from the west, so he caused a second flood. He repeated the process 5 times with no different results. Finally, he gave up, saying this is going to make trouble in the future, and there has been trouble in the world since then. Zawalki tried to make people. He formed figures from grass and mud, ordered a house to appear, and gave the figures to his companion to put on the house. Dogs arose from this creation attempt. He tried again using white sand, but those figures gave rise to snakes. He attributed these failures to the footprints. The world became inhabited by large dogs and snakes. He crushed the 10 biggest snakes in baskets of mixed fresh and salt and water in the ocean. 2 bad snakes got away and gave rise to today's snake-like animals. Zawalki ordered the 2 to encircle the world and hold it together. He also crushed 5 bad dogs and threw them in a ditch. They gave rise to water monsters. Soon after, his companion smoked for 3 days and created a house from which a woman emerged. Zawalki told his companion, the husband, Zawalki straightened out the world and made more animals and went up in the sky, saying, as he went to his companion, his wife, and their 16 children would speak different languages and become progenitors of different tribes. So obviously these guys are smoking a lot of weed and making stuff up, but you still see these basic elements, okay? Shem, Ham, and Japheth have 16 kids. It's a man and the woman repopulating the earth. There's something about a first and second flood, and people being made of different stuff, which you find all over Native American. The idea of people being made from maize, I figured out. The reason they say maize, that's what they say in Mesoamerica, that they're made of maize. But there's a reason, and I found this, I believe it was like a Hopi or one of these tribes in Southeast America or the United States. But maize is because of its different colors. So they say they made people out of maize because maize can come out in red, yellow, white, and blue or black. So you remember the Native American medicine wheel, which talks about it has a red, yellow, white, and black. What that medicine wheel is meant to describe, if you talk to Native Americans, they'll be like, this is our Bible. What it's meant to describe is the distribution of peoples throughout the world. And so you can literally take this medicine wheel, and on one side, you have the general trajectory of yellow people here, red people here, black people here, white people here, which is like Africa, Europe, Northeast Asia, and Southeast Asia. basically it, okay? Flip it over, and you have the opposite of that as these people come to the New World. So, well, back before they had that, they had maize. And look, you could have one piece of maize, and it's like, there you go. You just have these different colors mixed together, right? And they'd be like, that's where black people came from, that's where yellow people came from, that's where white people came from, that's where red people came from. These most recent people were made out of maize. Why? Because after the dispersion of languages, people isolated by their tribal groups and their different skin colors tended to exacerbate, and they started to look more distinct. But for some reason, over in Mesoamerica, even though they all look the same around them, they remember black, white, and yellow people, even though they're red people. And the people north of them remember the red people and the people with hairy heads and the people with hair all over their bodies, even though they all have no hair all over their bodies, just hairy heads. They remember the other kind of people in their myths and legends. So it's very clear that these people are all pointing to the same thing. And when you grab the common elements of these things, and I mean all the details, the bow, the bitumen, the number of people, the birds being sent out, the sacrifice, the rainbow, yada yada, the sun being cursed afterwards, all of these details, the languages being confused afterwards, all of these details, there is not a corner of the planet you can't find them in. And you might not find them all in one plate, one myth, except for the Bible. But you find all of the details that are nowhere else except for the Bible. Whereas you find these different things, like a man having a wife that becomes a dog, or a dog that becomes a wife, or the incest couple, or the giving birth to a gourd, they're all isolated over here. And you find all the people that can become a man or an animal in the incest myths, they're all over here and over here. All of them. Whereas all the ones that contain the most elements of the Bible legend are in the places of the more advanced civilizations around 1700, or between 1700 and 1500, and with the biggest consolidation of common points to the biblical story, not centered around the Atrahasis, not centered around the Mythology Sutra or the Epic of Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim, or any of these stories in Mercury and the Lord of the Rada. That's not where you find the most common details with the Bible. Where you find the most common details with the Bible is in Persia, in Siberia, in the region of the Japhethites around Ararat, because they all dispersed from Ararat. Okay? So you're going to find more about the birds and the sacrifice and the rainbow and the boat and the saving all the plants and animals and the wife and the common names and stuff like that, and the number of people being 3 sons and all this stuff. You're going to find the most correlation with the biblical details in a radius around Ararat. So if somebody was a Christian and a Bible believer and would do this scientifically, I promise you that's what you're going to find in terms of distribution. These people hate the Bible, though, and they hate the Bible being true, and so they're like, oh, the Bible story was ripped off from the Atrahasis. Do you know what's in common with the Bible and the Atrahasis? A guy surviving a flood. That's it. A guy surviving a flood. Name Atrahasis. You have nothing else. You have, supposedly they say Zeusudra means, now I can tell you, it means Zeus of the flood. That's Zeus of the flood, god of the flood. That's what Zeusudra means in Japhethite. What it means in Sumerian, they think it means he who found long life. Well, that's not what it means. That's what Utnapishtim means. And what you find in Sumerian and Akkadian, after the Tower of Babel, the Sumerians skedaddled. So what you have is the Akkadians telling you what their words mean and what their characters mean and stuff like that. And it's not connected to the actual etymology of the symbols. This is why people have so much trouble trying to figure out what Sumerian means. It's because it's the Akkadians who know the Sumerians and remember the Sumerians, but can't read their language because of the Tower of Babel, telling you, oh, Zeusudra has the exact same meaning as Utnapishtim. It's just a different language. No, it isn't. It's the Japhethite god of the flood. And these guys just happen to have a record of it. And it's old. It's after the Gutians, the Japhethite Gutians invade, but it's older than Upatnashim by like 600 years. It's older than the Atrahasis by a couple hundred years. So why would it have the same name meaning as Upatnashim 600, 700 years later? It wouldn't. They're just claiming it's the same person because that's the king of the last guy who survived the flood. And Upatnashim in the Epic of Gilgamesh is the last survivor from the flood. Which Upatnashim is probably based on Shem. It's probably not based on Noah. Zeusudra is probably either based on Noah or Japheth, but probably Noah after he's dead. And Atrahasis is probably based on Noah too, but it literally means the exceedingly wise one. Okay? But the common sense is like, wait a minute. If all these same people were ruled by 5 different groups of people, but all using Sumerian cuneiform and Akkadian cuneiform for hundreds and hundreds of years, and basically ruling over an empire that ruled over the same region, why do they have 5 different names for Noah in this one region? And why do they have 5 different names for Noah and none of the other biblical details? Like, you have a couple of them that have a boat. The boat is crazy sized, but that's about it. You have a guy getting saved on a boat. That's about all they have in common. Whereas you go over here to Lithuania and Siberia and China and Mesoamerica and all these other places, and there's so many much more similar details to the Ark story. In these North American, Native American tribes, you have so many more details that are similar. And what these guys, these academic scholars will say is that, well, that's because the Christian missionaries taught them that, and that's why they believe it. They don't want to believe that these people... You look at these stories and you just read them and you're just like, these are so crazy different than the Bible story. And yet there's these little details that are from the Bible story. And you're just like, you're trying to tell me that the Christian missionaries taught them that story. That is nothing like the Bible. It has weird gods and people transforming into frogs and all kinds of weird stuff in it. But it has a rainbow and a guy sending out a bird after a flood and repopulating the earth. Like, use some common sense. And you're like, the Bible is true. And after the fact, these guys are just bootlegging these stories and making up stuff and merging them together. And they don't know the Tower of Babel. They know the languages are confused, and they know the people once looked a lot more alike and then became differentiated by color over a century or so, and by language. And so they remember that, and they have that in their myths and legends. They also know there are people who came from incest, and they have that in their legends too, just like we have the story of Lot and his daughters in the Bible. We have very common stories that, wait a minute, the story of Lot and his daughters was only a couple hundred years before all these stories probably started emerging. And it's not that hard to just use common sense and go, why do they think like that? And that's what you got here. So you've got hundreds of these flood. Like I looked at this one, and I probably have, I think, like 80 on this list alone, okay? There's another guy who wrote a book with like 400. There's another one who's, scholars say there's only 200 of them. No, there's a lot of variations in these stories, but I found a guy who just was recording them in Southeast Asia, and he's going to find like 50 just in Southeast Asia. Because these stories have common elements to them, but they change. It's a telephone game. But so they're different stories with common elements to them. So we know some of these common elements had their origin like here, or like here, somewhere around here, somewhere around here. Others are common to the whole earth. Okay? And what your scholars are going to say is that they're common to the whole earth because they all remember the Younger Dryas, and a lot of them remember the Ice Age from 50,000 years before that. Well, this is how stupid that is. If they're that bad at remembering within 100 years whether the guy banged his dog, or he had a dog and had 2 kids, or he slept with his daughter, or the dog turned into a girl, or the woman had a dog and it turned into her husband, and all the different versions of that, you think they remember 50,000 years ago? You think they remember 50,000 years ago? And what was going on in the 50,000 years between that? Nothing but ice. Nothing but ice and snow. Where's their story of ice and snow? You think they remember before the ice and snow, but they don't remember the ice and snow? And you look across the whole world, and you've got, that I can find, you're welcome to find more, 3 versions of the ice. Okay, floods coming from receding ice ages. Okay, one is going to be in the Norse, who are up here in the Arctic, where you still have the polar ices. You still have the remnants of what was once down here. The other one is down here. This is the Yima myth. That's one. This is the original. These people, it's called the Ymir myth. The Yima myth and the Ymir myth. There's a giant called Ymir, and Ymir the giant is destroyed, and his blood floods the whole earth. He's a frost giant. This is literally like Thor and his brother, or Odin and his brothers kill him. Okay, that's the Ymir myth. So the Yima myth, it seems to be based on a Noah. The Ymir myth seems to be based on a giant who was killed by 3 brothers. Ymir the giant is Yima, who is Noah, and the 3 brothers are Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This is not rocket science, okay? So you have Ymir and Yima. Well, it's not rocket science to sit here and go, all the Japhethites were once here, and that story came over here and it morphed in legend, okay? These guys were tripping on something, some kind of mushroom, and they were becoming raiding Vikings and coming up with crazier ideas, okay? Another version is all the way down here. Well, what's all the way down here? Well, there's this tribe that lives in these mountainous regions where there's snow-capped mountains, and this would have been closest to the Antarctic ice shelves as they're receding. So, surprise, surprise, the last people to see the ice shelves disappear from Antarctica, living beneath snow-capped mountains, have a flood legend about how the flood came from melting ices. So these guys here, these guys up here, and these guys right here, who are probably the descendants of the Oxus civilization right here, which was all probably right under the flood, or right south of the ice caps, and then they kept spreading with the ice caps from here until the Tower of Babel, and then they all dispersed. These people, remember, this is called Yima, and this is called Ymir. Okay, the giant's called Ymir, the Noah figure is called Yima. Okay, these people down here are called the Yamana people. You literally have Yima, Ymir, and Yamana are the 3 people, the 3 names. It's called the Yamana myth, the Yima myth, and the Ymir myth. And it turns out that Hema is the word for snow. This is why they think it's not the abode of Ham, Himalayas, it's the abode of snow. Okay? Hema, Chaim is snow. Okay? Hema, I don't know if it comes from Yima, but they sound a lot alike, and it wouldn't shock me if somebody from here to here would transliterate Hema and Yima into Hema. It's not shocking to me. It's not shocking to me that someone would translate Yima into Ymir, or Yima into a Yamana people, like these are the people of Yima. And some of these Japhethites that came over here, they became the Yamana people, because they're descended from Yima, which is who they account their forefather to, okay? That's it. That's what I got. So anyways, I'm going to consolidate this all into this Babel effect, and you're going to hear about these different people, the Avestans, the Oxus, the Malaysian peoples, or I call what they call the Indus or the Maluha or the Harappan civilization. I just call them all Malaysian because I believe that was the original name of them, or the Maluhan, because the Malaysians used to be called the Malayan, and Maluha is probably Malaya, and then it became Malayan, and then it became Malaysian. So I just call these people the Malaysian civilization. I might change it before I publish. Then you're going to have the Olmecs, which are going to pop up within like 100 years of the Tower of Babel, maybe 2. And they're sacrificing people, and the other people who they basically came in among, they weren't sacrificing people, but they're going to start sacrificing people. And then I go over these major myths that are all over the different world cultures, and then I go over the flood legends and the lowered sea levels, and then I land you on Egypt, because that's where the next chapter is going to be going in. So that's probably all I'm going to get into for that. Again, this is meant to be to tease out these subjects, so if you want to, you can dig further, and I'm going to try to have a good bibliography with a bunch of resources you guys can read if you want to go further with this. It would be way too exhaustive. Like, just this Babel effect, you could write a 1,000-page book on this. There's just so much you could go on, and so much rationale you could do to attach this to the Bible. that it's like a whole creation ministries website and stuff like this, and I would love to spend my life doing that. It's just not enough time. I am going to jump into Egypt, and Egypt with Israel, and then Egypt after they subject Israel. So this is going to cover another period of about 250 years to Moses. From Joseph to Moses, it's about 200, I think it's like 240 years by the time they come out. From the death of Joseph to the birth of Moses is only like 40 years. It's not a long time. But it's going to talk about the Gnostic inversion that happens among the Egyptians, where they turn on the cult of Ra, because remember, Joseph is married into the cult of Ra on his wife's side. And then I'm going to get into stuff having to do with the Book of the Dead and the stuff that the Egyptians would have believed before, the early Hamites, before the Jews get there, and then while the Jews are there, and then after the Jews are gone. And again, this is, some of it is speculation, some of it is theory, some of it is just as like, what does this text say? When is it dated? Where does that line up to with the Bible date? And then use some common sense, okay? Everywhere I can, I'm using mainstream data. It's like this 4.2 kiloyear event. It's not rocket science to be like, could they be off by up to 100 years and that's the wind that blew? Yes. These guys are just like, we find all these civilizations disappearing between 2300 and 2200 based on carbon dating. Could your carbon dating be off by 100 years? Absolutely. These guys have like a 175-year span of when Hammurabi existed. And that's like 600 years after that. And Hammurabi is very well attested in history. He founded Babylonia. So absolutely, these guys can be off by 100, 150 years in their carbon dating. And if they're off by 100 years, that puts them dead square with the flood and a great wind that wiped the waters off the earth from the flood. That's what the Bible says. Okay? So I'm going to use mainstream data that you guys can find and connect as much as I can. Where I'm speculating, I'm going to make it clear that I'm speculating. But I don't think I'm speculating a ton. I think I'm adding the Masoretic flood in, and I am adjusting things that look like fake and propaganda where they obviously can't possibly match with the Masoretic text. Okay? And there's not a ton of them. I think if somebody who was an LXX fan tried to do this exact same thing, they would have a much harder time with the archaeological, the genetic, and the mythological data. So we'll see if anyone ever steps up to try to challenge this. They probably won't, but I hope you guys will be blessed by this when you get to read it. So hope you guys have been blessed by this teaching. Batman out. Peace.
Peace, I'm out. I'm Batman.